Give me DSO up here now. DSO. Multiple law enforcement entries. DSO, get up here. All right, we're 30 seconds out. We need some reinforcements up here now. They're starting to pull the gates down. They're throwing metal poles at us.
On January 3rd, 2021, an internal Capitol Police intelligence report warned that Congress could be the target of violent Trump supporters in the coming days. Later that day, then Police Chief Stephen Sund started getting worried about the growing number of expected protesters. Most of us know what happened next, and it's what we're going to be talking about all this week. Early in the morning on January 6th, Trump supporters started migrating towards the White House. At noon, then President Donald Trump gave an hour-long speech repeating false claims about a stolen election. He urged his supporters to march to Pennsylvania Avenue, where Congress was confirming Joe Biden's victory. And they did, thousands of them. At 1 p.m., Police Chief Sund requested backup from the D.C. police. They came within 13 minutes. Shortly after, Sund asked for authorization to call in the National Guard. He was told his request had to be run up the chain for approval. By 2 p.m., rioters overtook Capitol Police and forced their way into the Capitol. At 2:30 p.m., Police Chief Sund made another urgent request for the National Guard during a conference call. On the call, an Army official said he worried about the visual of the National Guard surrounding the Capitol. Around this time, all law enforcement in the city were called to respond to the riot. As things grew more chaotic inside, some officers retreated, fearing they'd be overtaken by the mob. Others fought back. More than 100 officers were wounded. The National Guard didn't arrive at the Capitol until 5:40 p.m. This timeline is according to the Washington Post. A year later, many of us are still trying to understand what went wrong in the immediate response to the January 6th riot. Police Chief Sund resigned not long after it happened. After the break, we'll talk about what's been done since to make sure another attack doesn't happen. We'll start the conversation with the new Capitol Police Chief, Zaid Manger. He told me where he thinks things went wrong on the day of the insurrection when I last spoke with him. I'm Jen White. You're listening to the 1A podcast. A reminder that you can join future conversations. Download our 1A Vox Pop app and leave us a voicemail. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
This message is brought to you by the NPR Coffee Club. A subscription brings fresh roasted coffee directly to your door, and you can also give a gift subscription to the NPR superfan in your life. Learn more about our new NPR blends by visiting us at nprcoffeeclub.org.
What happens when you're pushed to the limit? And what does it take to go further? I'm Jay Williams, and those questions define my journey to the NBA and beyond. But overcoming limits is something we all have to do. So come with me as I explore how with some of the biggest names in sports, business, and culture. Listen to my new show, The Limits, from NPR.
Over this last year and a half, the world's been through a lot. So on this season of the StoryCorps podcast, we'll hear stories reminding us that even when times are hard, we can still begin again. Listen to our new season wherever you get your podcasts.
We're talking about the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The new Capitol Police Chief is Zaid Manger. He told me where he thinks things went wrong on the day of the insurrection when I spoke to him last month.
If you'd asked me on January 6th, where do I think things went wrong, I probably wouldn't have had a very informed opinion, other than the law enforcement didn't have enough people there. But as I have been here now for 5 months, I can look back and say, you know, there were training issues, there were equipment issues, there was no formalized process for mutual aid, there were staffing issues for the police department. So as I look back, I see things like the intelligence component did not do the things it was supposed to do. Their civil disturbance unit was overwhelmed. There was just, and you couldn't tell by looking, or I couldn't tell by looking at it, but just the planning for the whole event wasn't adequate.
Well, I want to hone in on that intelligence piece for a moment, because there were signs that January 6th would turn into something potentially violent. Where did the intelligence break down and the communication to officers who were on the ground so that they would be adequately prepared?
I think that it broke down in a number of ways. One, at the time, the Capitol Police was fairly dependent on the FBI and Homeland Security and agencies like that for their intelligence. We didn't have folks that were plugged into the intelligence community the way we perhaps should have, the way we actually have now. We didn't have the folks that had the right training to do the analysis of the intelligence that we received. We weren't sharing it with other partners, and the whole purpose of intelligence is to inform operational decisions. I mean, you get this intelligence information, and then you make decisions based on that about how are we going to plan for an event, how are we going to structure our response. And of course, then there's the dissemination issue, which you mentioned, and we did a very poor job of disseminating this intelligence to our own people. So all those areas have seen significant improvement: the gathering, analyzing, sharing, using it to make operational decisions, disseminating to our own people. We do all that now. Before January 6th, it wasn't the case.
I just want to be clear. Do you, in your analysis, was the breakdown between these outside agencies like the FBI and what they were communicating to the Capitol Police, or was the breakdown that information was being communicated to the Capitol Police, but then that information wasn't making it to the officers who were actually on the ground?
There was some information that came to the Capitol Police, and intelligence is not an exact science. You get information, and you have to determine, is this information credible? Is it likely that in fact, this is accurate information? Because we get information that's all over the map. I mean, you get chatter from social media about different things, and you look at it and say, well, not likely that this is actually credible. You make those judgments about intelligence information, and typically it's trained analysts who make that judgment. We didn't have those trained analysts making those judgments about the intelligence that came to us. But I think so. Where I know, in fact, there was a breakdown was the fact that we did not disseminate that information to all the people that needed to get it. Today, all of our cops have cell phones that were issued by the department to deal with whatever occurred.
What have you been hearing from the officers who report to you in this year after the insurrection about what their needs and concerns are?
I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to my officers, whether it's in roll call or just as I walk around the campus and I stop and I talk to folks. But there's certain themes that I'm hearing a lot on, and one is about officer safety and wellness. And this January 6th was a very difficult and frankly a traumatic event for many of our officers, and for the police department to have a health and wellness program in place was something that we desperately needed. But I'll tell you that the biggest issue by far is staffing issues that we're dealing with. We've lost 130 to 140 people since January 6th. A lot of retirements, some resignations, actually a couple of deaths, several people who have been fired. But to add to that, in 2020, for 10 months, Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy in Georgia, where we have to send all our recruits, was shut down because of COVID. So for 10 months out of the year in 2020, we weren't able to put any new recruits through the academy. So you take a year where you're not allowed or not able to add people, make the next year where you have a dramatic increase in attrition, where you've got more people leaving than coming in, and all of a sudden you find yourself over 200 officers short from where you were prior to January 6th. And frankly, with all the increasing workload demands, we are now over 400 officers short of where we need to be.
What's causing that increased workload demand?
A number of things. One is the threats against members of Congress. They have gone through the roof. Back in 2016, we had about 900 cases of, whether it was anonymous phone calls or social media posts or just direct threats against the members of Congress. And not all of those cases rose to the level of being a crime, but they were certainly cases that warranted us to look into them. And we had 900 of them in 2016. This year, 9,000.
Well, Chief, that raises the issue that the conditions that made January 6th possible have not gone away. There are real concerns around the next election, what the response could be. What are you doing to prepare for the possibility of another attack?
So most of the improvements we've made in terms of our intelligence capacity, our having the civil disturbance unit, the coordination from agencies around the National Capital Region, our coordination with the National Guard, our better event planning process. We're working with the architect of the Capitol to make improvements in the physical infrastructure here. So all of those things are in place. All of those things have been significantly improved since the 6th. So I feel like we are much better prepared, and I feel fairly confident that that we could be prepared for anything moving forward. Now, look, Jen, I'll say that with some sense of I don't want this to sound like a challenge to somebody saying, "Oh yeah, the Capitol Police can handle anything," and then have somebody view that as a challenge to say, "Well, next time we'll attack this differently." I'm not trying to encourage that. I just am saying that we are much better prepared for an event like January 6th than we've ever been before.
So last question here, Chief. There's the operations side of preparation, and then there's the morale side of preparation. How are you handling that piece of this?
Morale is a big issue, and I think the primary driver of the morale issues in the department, look, it began right after the 6th with officers feeling like the department let them down. And, in fact, the department was not prepared. And make no mistake, the men and women of this police department fought valiantly that day. And, in fact, as I reminded them when I took this job, look, not one member of Congress was hurt, and they ultimately were able to complete their legislative duties that night. So, in essence, we prevailed. But there were significant injuries, significant loss of life. And so, nobody's thinking that, gee whiz, it went just fine. It didn't. And now it's the staffing issues. I mean, we've got officers that go long periods of time without a day off. They're having their leave canceled. They're having their days off canceled. They're being held over because we're short on a particular shift. And unless we get the staffing issues addressed, I think morale is still going to be an issue.
That was Capitol Police Chief J. Thomas Manger. And let's bring some new voices into the conversation. Margaret Barthel is a reporter for the WAMU newsroom. That's our home station. She was at the Capitol on the day of the attack. Margaret, it's great to have you. Also with us is Kelly Carter-Jackson. She's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Kelly, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Mark Zaid. He's a national security attorney and managing partner at the law firm of Mark S. Zaid. He's currently representing Capitol Police officers who were working the day of the attack. Mark, welcome back.
Good morning and Happy New Year.
Kelly, Mark, I first want to get your reactions to what we just heard from Capitol Police Chief Manger. Kelly, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to take in. I think that when we are looking at the 1-year anniversary, we're looking at what things could have been done better, what things could have changed, what things could have been prevented. And I think we're also looking back through the lens of a pandemic, that was, I can't say when the climax of the pandemic has been, but like the idea that looking back through this lens of how we've seen inaction and culpability and the capacity to be able to act in this moment all take place. It's really interesting to me, and I'm excited to talk about like how we can rethink some of the things that have happened.
Mark, what about you?
I was encouraged by his remarks. I had dealt with Chief Manger when he was in neighboring Montgomery County, and so far I think he's done a very positive job in trying to reform the Capitol Police. Some of these reforms were already in motion prior to January 6th, and it was just taking time to implement, obviously not expecting January 6th to happen. But there are clearly still some problems that exist, as he detailed, that are going to have to be addressed. Some of them are logistical in nature, and it's going to require others to intervene, as he described with obviously the impact of COVID in FLETC, the law enforcement training facility. But there, as was just said, we're going to have to look at sort of two things. How do we deal with what happened January 6th, and how do we deal with preventing another January 6th?
Now, Margaret, last month you spoke to Colonel Craig Hunter, who's the Chief of Staff for the D.C. Army National Guard, and here's some of what he said about being on the front lines that day.
My goal was to locate the MPD's leadership because I knew at some point they would request the D.C. National Guard's assistance. And normally in our training, we're trained to go and meet with the leadership so we can begin the coordination process. The initial response was 154, so that was the initial response. And we began to build off of that throughout the night. As our National Guardsmen arrived to begin to support Metropolitan Police Department, I walked around the Capitol that night. We saw doors, that had been broken. The presidential scaffolding was there that was coming up, so that was torn down. Most of that scaffolding had been pulled apart in different areas. As we walked around the actual platform where the presidential inauguration would take place, there was broken shields from Capitol policemen there. How quickly things change and were evolving was very similar to combat operations. I did not have time to really think about the weight of it because things were moving so fast, and my goal was just to react, respond, make sure our guardsmen are taken care of, and make sure we're assisting with the Capitol Police and with MPD.
Now, Margaret, one thing that came to light the day of the insurrection was just the number of law enforcement bodies that operate in D.C. You have the Metropolitan Police Department, also known as MPD, the Capitol Police, the D.C. National Guard. Break down these different bodies for us and how they intersected on January 6th.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question in a city like DC where there are dozens of law enforcement agencies. Of course, you have the Capitol Police, which was the agency in the lead because the Capitol building and grounds are their jurisdiction. Then you have the Metropolitan Police Department, which is DC Police. They're responsible for, kind of the streets and surrounding areas in the city, and they were doing crowd control and, had some checkpoints set up at the rally earlier that morning. Then you have, as you heard from Colonel Hunter, the National Guard, the DC National Guard, which is kind of in reserve and can support those law enforcement agencies. And then you have, mutual aid agreements with numerous other agencies from law enforcement agencies from neighboring jurisdictions that can be called in to support. So when I was there on the ground that day, I remember seeing the Prince George's County, Maryland Police Department, for instance. There I saw, Virginia State Police arriving later in the evening, and then also federal law enforcement agencies. The FBI was there. So there's really an enormous amount of coordination, as you heard from Colonel Hunter, that has to go on between all of these different bodies to figure out, kind of what's the strategy and who's going to do what.
We got this tweet from Jay who says, you didn't need to have the National Guard confront demonstrators until necessary, but they needed to be deployed nearby so they could act expediently. I don't see why that didn't happen. Now, Margaret, after January 6th and the slow response in activating the National Guard, there was a push to give D.C.'s mayor control of the Guard, and that was originally in the defense bill but got cut before it passed. So who controls the Guard now, and do we know why this got dropped from the bill?
Yeah, so at this point, the Guard is still controlled by the Pentagon. As you said, because D.C. doesn't have statehood, in any other state, the Guard would be controlled by the state's governor. We have a mayor who is not able to do that, and unfortunately, as you said, in the defense authorization bill, that was dropped during the negotiations between the House and the Senate. What they did do in Congress was that they passed a bill that said that the U.S. Capitol Police Chief is empowered to request direct assistance from the D.C. Guard instead of going through these kind of layers of congressional and military bureaucracy to ultimately get to requesting them from the Pentagon. So that it's cut out a little bit of the kind of middlemen that that were, that seemed to have been part of the delay on January 6th. But it certainly hasn't, the Congress certainly hasn't done anything to, really empower DC to have control over, this force that can help protect the city in an event like this.
We're talking to WAMU reporter Margaret Barthel. Also with us is Kelly Carter-Jackson. She's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College, and national security attorney Mark Zaid. We also want to hear from you. How are you thinking about accountability and the law enforcement response a year after the January 6th attack? If you work in law enforcement, we'd love to get your reaction to how it was handled. You can comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or send us an email at 1A@WAMU.org. Now, Mark, you currently represent several of the Capitol Police officers who were working when the attack happened. They were trying to control the crowd, protect Congress, protect themselves. Just give us a brief understanding of what the experience was like for them.
Well, it was very traumatic. These are trained, experienced law enforcement officers, some with military backgrounds as well, but they weren't prepared for what happened that day. And I think that's obviously part of what the chief has to be looking at, because while it would have been difficult perhaps to predict in a realistic way that this was what was going to happen, it's at least in an abstract way, one would think the Capitol Police and other federal law enforcement and military officials would be prepared for some sort of siege on the U.S. Capitol, probably from a foreign perspective, but obviously now we have to deal with domestic. But Officer Dunn, Harry Dunn, experienced a lot of racial epithets thrown at him. Sergeant Gunnell, who I represent as well, both men testified before the January 6th committee on that first public hearing last year in July. He was injured, is still on limited administrative duty as a result. I also represent a whistleblower who is now the top intelligence official over at the Capitol Police, as they try and, as the chief described, restructure what happened. But I will say that the officers today are continuing to suffer in many ways, emotionally, mentally, physically, from the events of almost a year ago. And that's going to take a lot of time, no doubt, to recover from.
Mark, it was later revealed that those in charge were warned about what could happen. As we heard from Chief Manger, many officers felt let down by the department that day. How does this square with what you've heard from the officers you represent?
I think that's consistent. And in fact, when I was first involved with the Inspector General investigation by the D.C. Capitol Police, really right after the events, it was clear that they had an understanding of some things going to happen, and they weren't adequately prepared. Officer Dunn has publicly spoken out about how there was a lack of gear that was available to them. They weren't prepared. I mean, that's just the blanket statement of what was going on. And it's sort of, I guess, a catch-22. You can be critical of how the response happened. It just depends on where you want to direct it to. Because these officers, the vast, vast majority of them who were on the ground, were trying to do their job, trying to defend the U.S. Capitol and the members of Congress and the elected administration. And at least in that sense, fortunately, they succeeded, because it obviously could have been far, far worse than it turned out to be.
We're discussing law enforcement and accountability a year after the January 6th attack. As a reminder to have your questions answered on future topics, or just to let us know what you think, tweet us at 1A.
Support for NPR and the following message come from BetterHelp, offering online counseling. BetterHelp therapist Hesu Jo knows that lockdown has been hard on us as humans.
We as people are hardwired to connect with others, which is why this whole time is so difficult. The connection that happens between people can be very powerful, and how healing it can be to have a healthy relationship with someone.
To get matched with a counselor within 48 hours and save 10%, go to betterhelp.com/1A.
This week on The Indicator from Planet Money, we're revisiting our favourite episodes of the year, like behind the scenes of how inflation is measured. We also visit a New Jersey hot dog stand that explains a small business boom. We talk to an economist using auctions to save the birds. Follow The Indicator, the daily economics podcast from NPR.
Over this last year and a half, the world's been through a lot. So on this season of the StoryCorps podcast, we'll hear stories reminding us that even when times are hard, we can still begin again. Listen to our new season wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's get back to our conversation about law enforcement and accountability a year after the January 6th attack. We got this question from Michael, who says these folks say they are preparing to make the system adequately respond to any future insurrections. But if Trump or anyone like him is in the White House, he or they would squelch any efforts to adequately respond. And Tom writes, please address the apparent Trump administration attempts to delay or prevent National Guard support using terms such as unfavorable optics in the excuses. Mark, what can you tell us about that?
Those are really tough questions, and this is what we're struggling with as a democracy. When you have elected officials, whether you like or agree with them as to what type of power that they have. And I think we're going to continue to struggle with this, obviously, as we move forward. The issue about the National Guard is it's a legitimate concern that some in the Pentagon had with respect to optics. Doesn't mean it was the right decision to make or that it shouldn't have been rendered earlier as far as how to supply some sort of military assistance. But that in our country is a very sensitive issue with respect to military personnel and civilian interaction. So that was not a small decision to be made. And I'm sure, in fact, I don't have to say I'm sure, I know that the January 6th Select Committee is obviously looking into that fact to see whether, in fact, additional parameters need to be put in place to enable a better reaction. Well, hopefully, if there's never a next time, but if there is.
Kelly, did you have something to add?
No, I think that we're all going to be grappling with this for a really long time. What can we do going forward? How can we prevent something like this from happening? And how can we make sure that we examine all of the pitfalls, racial and political?
And what are you hearing from officers about the fact that they are sworn to protect people who have actually supported the big lie, that the election was stolen, who went forward from the insurrection and still voted to overturn the election?
Well, the officers are undertaking a nonpartisan position. Their job as sworn law enforcement is to protect the members of Congress and their staff and those who are within the Capitol area. And it doesn't matter. They may have obviously their own opinions like everyone does, but their sworn duty surmounts their personal opinions. And while Officer Dunn and Sergeant Gunnell have been very outspoken in the last few months, to the credit of the Capitol Police Department allowing it, that I made sure that they were authorized and stayed within parameters, you will never have heard and will not hear them criticizing the individual members who exercised their democratic vote, whether we agree or disagree with it, on that day and since then. But, you know, it is a sort of moral and mental difficulty that they have to grapple with, knowing that they are protecting and will continue to protect these individuals who in many ways seem to be supporting the events of what happened on January 6th.
We also got this email from Heather who says, the last demonstration, which I attended several years ago, prohibited backpacks and poles for flags as safety measures. The first thing I noticed on the morning of January 6th was that there was clearly no such prohibition. Seemed like a double standard and poor judgment and poor preparation with even public perceptions of the risks. Now, Margaret, in the summer of 2020, we saw law enforcement use aggressive crowd control measures on Black Lives Matter protesters here in D.C., and you were one of the main reporters at WAMU covering those protests. Describe the difference you saw in how law enforcement responded to Black Lives Matter protesters and those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
Yeah, I certainly did see evidence of this criticism that police were not nearly as aggressive with the insurrectionists as they were in the previous year with racial justice protesters, or even in the case of the Capitol Police with other progressive activists who have staged protests in and around the Capitol building in recent years. So I can give you an example. After curfew at 6 p.m., I watched as the police surrounded the sort of dwindling crowd of rioters. This is in a maneuver that's called a kettle. Basically, they just sort of tighten the circle, and then usually they start making a lot of arrests. This is something that I've seen very frequently at racial justice protests. It's often in D.C. It's resulted in mass arrests of 40 or more people, sometimes, per night, getting up into the hundreds. But this time I saw a lot of rioters who were just allowed out of the circle and allowed to head home. And I also think that the arrest numbers themselves are telling. This was obviously a much larger crowd on January 6th than many of the crowds that we've seen at most racial justice protests in the city. But the Capitol Police reported arresting just 14 people that night. Sometimes at racial justice protests, we would see several hundred people arrested. So that does feel significant. I should note, of course, that there are some people in police leadership who have responded to some of those criticisms. They've said that the situation was just so dire in this case that they were focused on securing the Capitol grounds and they didn't feel that they could conduct mass arrests at the time. And of course, as we know, the FBI has since been tracking people down and made hundreds of arrests in the interim. But it was very significant watching it unfold on the ground and really felt like a pretty serious point of comparison for me, having seen what I saw at the previous summer.
And Kelly, in just the next 30 seconds, what do you hope we learn from January 6th and the police response we saw that day?
I think we get very honest about the double standard in this country and how we have too often exaggerated Black violence while trivializing white violence. And I think we have not held people accountable, this country in particular, for its racism and for its white supremacy. And if we don't deal with that we are in some ways doomed to keep on this steady cycle of wash, rinse, and repeat when it comes to white supremacy.
That's Kelly Carter-Jackson. She's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Also with us today, Mark Zaid, a national security attorney and managing partner at the law office of Mark S. Zaid, and Margaret Barthel, a reporter at WAMU. That's our home station. Margaret, Kelly, Mark, thanks for speaking with us. Today's producer was Haili Blassingame. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk more soon. This is 1A.